So with the exception of releasing the Rite, I've been very quiet this year. I never even made a video discussing the album, which I always do. But it's not that I've given up on doing any of this stuff. But actually the reason is I'll be moving in 1 week from Richmond, Virginia, where I've lived for the past 4 years, to New York City. And that's what I've been primarily preoccupied with. So I haven't had the time to sit down and do videos, even though it's something that I still would like to keep doing. Also, writing the next album, I've been very busy on that, and working on some other stuff as always. I'll save some of that for the end. There are a couple of things coming up, so I think I owe it to do in sort of channel update video, as I have done periodically before. And I want to start with the past and work my way forward. Last year, I started working on the Rite around the time that I was recording The Pathway, which would have been close to the end of summer. My goal was to create something that was entirely different from The Pathway, which was narrative driven, and instead to write an album that was focused on music for once. My motivation for doing this was actually in response to the video I made on riff wariness and habituation, where I stated the primary cause for that, I believe, is usually a stubborn lyricist refusing to compromise the narrative and thus stretching the music too thin because you need that extra verse or you always need that extra line. So the way I approached the Rite was to finish all of the music before I started writing any of the lyrics, which I think most musicians probably do, but that's actually a first for me. Songwriting is always a concurrent process. Sometimes I even write lyrics before coming up with any riffs. So this album, it was very new having to constrain my storytelling until after I had completed writing what I thought were the perfect sounding songs. So instead of actually putting down any lyrics, I focused on drafting the general concept of the story, which then made it very easy to open the gates as soon as the songwriting was finished and put together the lyrics to tell the story that I wanted to tell in this album. So from the very beginning of the project, I wanted to do something based on the Rite of Spring. My initial inspiration came from the fact that I'm a big fan of the symphony, the music, and when I listen to non-black metal music like Rite of Spring or like folk music or anything else, or even like regular heavy metal that's not black metal, sometimes I hear melodies and concepts that I feel would make great black metal songs. So one of the two covers I released in between The Pathway and the Rite was a black metal cover of Iron Maiden's Hallowed Be Thy Name, which served as a demonstration of this principle. Unlike a cover like Cradle of Filth, where they're just playing it with harsh vocals, what I did on was actually rewrite the song as if it were a black metal song, but using the same musical themes and so on. And the Rite of Spring was another example of this. Listening to the open melody of the symphony, I felt very strongly that it would make a great black metal riff, and the result is the opening track, which is the prologue. From here, I wanted to base the story on the album as well, just to make everything complete, and base it really on the story of the ballet, which is about a suicide cult that conducts a ritual where a dancer is chosen to dance himself to death in order to bring about the spring season. My original idea was to actually do a very dark album and write heavy music to support that. This is definitely the heaviest album that I've produced so far. My main influences came from Emperor and Dissection, which lent to the melodic black metal sound on Acts 2 and 3, as well as the more old school thrash and death metal influences that I took to create Act 1 and some of the beginning of Act 2. So the first story that I had come up for this album was to do something that would serve as the prequel to I Am the Black Wizards. The goal was to connect the classic from Stravinsky to the classic from Emperor, hence the influences. It was a very fantasy-based story about a sorcerer, performing a ritual to destroy his physical form in order to become immortal. This is a concept that you find repeatedly throughout my music, and it's based on my interpretation of Friedrich Nietzsche's Human All Too Human, one of my favorite philosophical works. The epilogue then would have been a cover of I Am the Black Wizards, which would have been really awesome. I had the whole thing planned out, the way that I was going to do it. It was, obviously, in this case, it's a black metal cover of a black metal song, so there wouldn't be too many changes, but I would have made it my own. I mean, I never think that there's a point to just do a direct cover of another song. I'm one of the types that never thinks the cover is better than the original. So that's not how I would have approached it. And it's something that would have been nice to do had I stuck with the plan, but things ended up changing. So what happened was, before I started the lyrics, I decided to watch a performance of the ballet, and that particular version, the YouTube video that I watched, I posted to my Facebook to help people prepare for the album before it was released. That was really inspiring and influenced me to actually stick with a more faithful representation of the Rite of Spring and write a realistic album about a suicide cult, which is honestly a lot more brutal. I mean, nothing's more brutal than reality, of course, right? So Jonestown was a good source for some of the lyrical themes, of course, being, you know, one of the most well-known mass suicides ever. But the album is actually primarily based on Heaven's Gate, the UFO cult in the 90s. That was the main sort of inspiration of how I wanted to create this, you know, suicide cult for my story. Still, I was a bit hesitant on actually keeping the association with the Rite of Spring, mainly because most people would go in listening to an album like this, you know, titled so, expecting something musically related to the original symphony, like an avant-garde piece using themes from Stravinsky's, you know, writing. But aside from the theme that's adapted for the prologue, the relation of this album to the ballet is purely narrative. It's kind of ironic because I mentioned at the very beginning that this was actually a musically driven album. The ultimate decision to call it The Rite there were two reasons actually. The fact that the prologue does use the main theme, so I would be ripping it off if I didn't give credit. And what's even more significant was my search for the cover art. So planning the album, my immediate thought was to use a set designed for the ballet, you know, a backdrop, preferably from the original production, you know, back when it was performed in Paris in, you know, 1910s. And I actually found exactly that. There's a very cool design by Russian artist Nicholas Roerich, featuring totem poles with skulls, spiky rocks, very metal, very cool. And very prominently in the center of that image is a large stone, presumably where the dancers would have danced around and done whatever the ritual sacrifice was. Probably would have taken place on that. And if you look at that stone, it looks almost exactly like the capital A in the Apathy logo, which I created, you know, way back 5-6 years ago. So, you know, being the greatest coincidence 100 years apart, you can't plan that. As soon as I saw that picture, I knew that I had to use it. And it really affirmed my decision to name the album The Rite, and I was very happy with that. Musically, I think this is the most interesting album. Definitely some of my best riffing, and absolutely my best guitar solo ever on Act 3. That's something that I'm very happy with. The production on this album continues to improve. This is once again the best sounding album, which is just natural because, you know, the only time I get to develop my skills is when I work on another album. So I've developed a lot more techniques on this. Actually, a lot of the great techniques on this album were developed when I was producing the two covers, which is kind of unfortunate because I didn't get to use them on the Pathway, and I think these techniques really contributed to making The Rite sound so much cleaner than everything in the past. Which does bring me to a side note. A long time ago, I made a live production commentary video that was supposed to teach people how I produced, you know, Apathy. I think that was after I released the first 4 albums up to Origins. Of course, at this point, that's completely obsolete. Almost all the techniques I talked about are irrelevant. The way that I record is completely different. The way that I produce and mix, it's all completely different. So that video needs to be redone because obviously at this point it's teaching bad habits. If I haven't removed it already, I should remove it now. So as for the lyrics, the story of the album came out pretty much exactly as I had envisioned it. Despite being constrained to the music as I had planned, I actually didn't find myself having to compromise much in order to achieve the story that I wanted, which sort of gives me confidence that this is the right way to proceed. Not that I have to write every song before I ever touch the lyrics, but just to keep a conscious thought in my mind that while lyrics are important to me, story is very important. Sometimes you don't have to say every single thing in order to get your point across. From an individual standpoint, none of the songs have anything that particularly stands out as being, you know, must hear. I think there are some great sections, especially the end of Act 2, and of course the guitar solo on 3, like I mentioned before. But what I really enjoy about this album the most is I think it all fits together as a very complete package because there's so much variety from one song to another. You have the fast songs, the heavy songs, the melodic songs, and it just, from start to finish, you know, it just keeps moving. It builds upon itself, and I think the big thing is it's just riff after riff after riff, which is how the album was intended to be, with tons of different influences and styles incorporated together. Now, till the present, the next time you hear from me, it's going to be in New York City. I do plan on picking up with videos again. The song breakdowns, it's a very important project. It's a way of demonstrating the application of this theory that I've discussed in all of my videos. And at the very least, it's also a way for me to just reflect back on the past and critically analyze my progression from then until now. It also forces me to relearn and practice how to play those songs so I don't get lazy. For real content, aside from that production video I just mentioned that I would like to do, I still really haven't added much to my songwriting approach, so there's not that many more theoretical concepts for me to discuss. I know that's the most interesting this channel ever offered, but I spent 2 good years putting all my thoughts down, and right now I'm very satisfied with the creative process I'm working with. So there's not much I would care to change or add. I mean, if I really wanted to, I could probably redo the old videos and make them better, but that's a lot of time to sink in on something, and at this point I'd rather much write music. Initially I wasn't sure which of the concepts I had that I was gonna really focus on, but there is one work right now in particular that's coming together very nicely. I think it's way too early to give any real details, but I'm shooting for something very big with the next release. Seeing as how I've done a couple of different types of albums to this point, from Return to the Pathway to the Rite, I think it's a good stage to look back and kind of summarize what I've learned and what I've accomplished during that point. So this is going to be a big album. It's going to be encompassing, and what I really want to do is take all these things and sort of push it to the absolute limit. In the past, I've always run on a very quick release schedule. When I feel like I'm not contributing anything more substantial to the songwriting on an album, then I consider myself finished and I move on. When I feel like I'm not making an album sound any better in production, I consider it done, and I release the album. Which is why, I'll announce an album and say it's going to be finished, by the end of the month, and then release it a week later, because that's just how I've approached things, and I've kind of been okay with it, and there have been some regrets. I think there have been albums in the past that could have used a little bit more refinement, a little bit more work. But so far, I've probably done a steady pace of 2 to 3 albums a year, and I guess the problem I've identified now is my lack of patience. So with this particular project, I want it to be great, so I don't think I'm going to release it another album this year, at least not a black metal Apathy album. Maybe some random miscellaneous stuff like Serpent or 11-5, things that get collected in the background that I could whip up really quick and put out just for the sake of getting it done. But the next Apathy album, I do think it's gonna be, at least for me personally, it's gonna be very big, and I think that it's gonna be something that people are gonna like. That's all for now. Say goodbye to Richmond, say goodbye to the scene. This next video is gonna be in a brand new room, brand new city, new back wall, same Iron Maiden flag that sticks with me for the rest of my life. And the next video is probably going back to Rebirth, talking about Sapphire Stones.